Just like with any MMO, class choice is going to be a very important part of your experience in the Lord of the Rings Online, and that is also definitely true when playing solo. So today we'll be looking at what is the best class for solo and leveling in LOTRO. And to start off, this might be a bit obvious, but I honestly do think the best class to play solo and level is the one that you have the most fun with. It's just something to keep in mind as we do evaluate each class. But briefly, I will be sharing what each class offers, like the pros and cons for it, and then we'll review the overall best class, and hopefully from that you can decide the best solo class for you. And if you are unfamiliar with the LOTRO classes, I'll have a little indicator on the bottom left for which class I am playing in the background. And finally, one more thing to stress is that every class can solo all solo content in the game, and even if you are skilled with your class or decently geared, every class can often solo more challenging content such as landscape quests intended for 3 or even 6 players and sometimes group dungeons. Of course, as we'll get to, some classes can solo group content better than others. So as we look at the classes, I'll evaluate them one on general speed, damage, and traveling capabilities, then general conveniences they might offer, and finally, self-sustain is going to be important with survivability and healing. In alphabetical order, we start with the Beorning, and this one is honestly quite the banger to start out with. The Beorning has great damage, great survivability, and they even have amazing self-sustain with great heals. Despite being a class with unique systems of skin changing into a bear, which is quite exciting, and they also have Wrath, it is actually, in my experience at least, relatively easy to pick up gameplay, and they don't really have the skill bloat that some other classes have. And for Beorning specializations, it is pretty straightforward. The red line will offer the most damage and speed while playing solo, while the blue line has great survivability and some moderate AoE damage potential, good for rounding up a whole bunch of mobs. And then the yellow line has some great healing. Of course, that's best utilized in a group, but for solo it still can be useful and has somewhat decent damage to go along with it. Now, for soloing challenging content that is too difficult for the speedy red line, both the blue and yellow line are really great options, even if a little bit slower. Now, as far as traveling goes, the Beorning does have some strengths there. They have a travel skill that gives them 62% movement speed, which is almost matching typical mount speeds and even surpasses some of the slower mounts in the game. And this is going to be the fastest out-of-combat passive travel buff that any class has in the game. Also, because the Beorning race and class are kind of packaged as one as an exclusive package, the racial trait to travel to Beorninghus is going to be quite convenient, especially because you can quickly swift travel directly to Bree. That's going to be South Bree, which is perhaps the mainest of main hubs in LOTRO. So really, there aren't many downsides with the Beorning, and honestly, one of the main downsides is they just don't have as many travel abilities as Hunter or Warden, which we'll get to those classes later and why they're a bit better at that with porting around Middle-earth. The latest class to the Lord of the Rings Online is the Brawler. As a note, this is the one class in the game that you still need to purchase with either the Goondabat expansion in the LOTRO market, so outside of the game, or on its own through the LOTRO store, which is the in-game store. But being so new, the Brawler has honestly been going through a bit of rapid balancing since its launch, so things may change quickly with this class as a note, but in general what it's going to offer is decent damage with some great burst damage potential, which is always nice on landscape. And especially that's true in that it's DPS redline, and then it has some moderate survivability overall, and that's of course improved in its tanking blue line. Now the Brawler's a little bit weird in that it only really has 2 real specs. It does have the third trait tree like all other classes, but those are just supplemental traits. Anyway, getting back on topic, the balancing lately has been trending towards improving, buffing the Brawler, impacting both its group and solo experience with improved damage and self-sustain. For traveling, that is where the Brawler does not really offer much. They can get up to plus 15% run speed in the yellow line, but otherwise they don't have anything else. On top of that, they are a melee class, so they do have one like moderate range ability, but you just have to do a little bit more work to get in combat with mobs. But that's something that's true of every melee class, really. And the other downside with the Brawler is going to be a lack of consistent self-heals, especially if you're looking to solo the difficult content type stuff. They do have decent cooldown heals nowadays, especially if you do play blue line, but for regular consistent self-healing in combat, it's just not quite there. So downsides aside, the The Brawler is the only class in the game where you can go around Middle Earth punching enemies. In my experience, their solo gameplay is actually fairly fluid, surprisingly. And I say surprisingly because in my experience, the group gameplay really isn't that fluid because you have tons of cooldown abilities on the Brawler and managing them solo is a lot easier. So as I mentioned, Brawlers have tons of combat buffs on short to long cooldowns, and they are just really easy to use between pools while solo. And this really allows you to get the most out of them and start combat with great burst damage. So overall, the Brawler's not really a bad choice for solo gameplay, it's just in my experience I wouldn't rate them the best in terms of like speed, damage, convenience, and self-sustain, but again, overall not bad. You may think that Burglars are a bad solo class because you never see any around, but that's just because they are all in stealth mode, which is honestly both a pro and a con for Burglars while playing solo. They are traditionally seen as a slow-paced class that sneaks into quest camps and they just like get the objective and then head out. But in modern day LOTRO, they offer great damage and can pretty safely just like plow through a questing camp just as other high DPS melee classes do. On top of that, they have plenty of utility with like lots of crowd control to survive through tough encounters. For their specs, the blue line offers moderate damage with actually pretty decent self-healing, while the red line tends to offer the most damage and great burst damage to eliminate mobs right at the start of combat like they kind of never existed in the first place. And then finally, the yellow line is going to be best served for group contents, but might be able to, depending on the situation, at least give you an edge in tougher content. Now, there is a reason Burglars are seen as slow, and that is because that is exactly their downside. Burglars offer no movement speed boost, and on top of that, they have no travel options for conveniently going around Middle Earth. Now, for solo gameplay, I think the Burglar is ultimately going to be aimed at somebody who's really into their class fantasy with like stealth, tons of utility tools, and very fast-paced combat and one-shotting mobs, and you can even like quickly deal with small groups of high health enemies and just almost eliminate them like an assassin type class. The class that is designed for group content to support allies through tanking buffs and healing. How does the Captain hold up for solo gameplay? Well, it does hold up, but very slowly. In my experience, the Captain is the slowest class for solo gameplay. What it does offer, however, is a unique experience because they have their Herald pet type companions, and they also have a pretty safe solo experience due to their survivability and self-heals, especially that's true if you're in the healing or especially the tank spec actually. Now for their other spec, that is going to be the red line, which of course offers the most damage, but it still won't be amazing compared to all the other classes in the game, especially starting around mid-levels. I actually do have to admit the low-level gameplay experience on the Captain, it's not really representative of how it plays at high levels. They're surprisingly strong, like level 5 to 10-ish. But anyway, outside of that, we do have to look at traveling, and Captains, they do have a movement speed boost on cooldown and otherwise don't really have anything, so they're not the best at that either. So for me personally, the worst thing about the Captain, playing it solo at least, is you miss out on so much of what the class offers when playing in a group, because it really is designed around being in a group and supporting your allies. Many of your abilities give some form of support, which your allies get the most out of, not you as a Captain, and you just really just lose out on all that potential when playing a Captain solo. That said, if you really do like the class fantasy and you like having a Herald follow you around maybe, and you can get past the slowness, the Captain might just be for you. The next class is one of the powerhouses in terms of damage. Champions have really high single target damage in the red line or really high AoE damage in the yellow line. Of course, at high levels, you can start mixing and matching a little bit at least. Champions also do have decent survivability and self-heals in the blue line to solo tougher content. And even in the other specs and the DPS specs, their self-heals have become better as of late with some somewhat recent balancing the past couple of years. Now, due to the Champion's straightforward gameplay kit, it's a very easy class to recommend for beginners that just want to like mow through mobs with relative ease. The main downside of the Champion is that it only has a cooldown movement speed boost for travel. They do have a ranged weapon for pulling enemies, but otherwise it's really a true melee class. And yeah, that is all there really is to the Champion. I think the few words I have for it speaks to its like easy to pick up gameplay, but I hope it really doesn't take away from how strong of a melee class the Champion is for solo gameplay. Once a competitor for the slowest class in the game as basically only a tank, the Guardian now offers moderate pace for solo gameplay. The red line gives the fastest experience as a DPS spec and certainly is strong nowadays. There is great potential actually in one-shotting mobs, and they have surprisingly quick attacks with things like Sting that offer a quick pace in combat and questing in general. The downside of the red line is going to be a lack of burst AoE damage that some other classes such as the champion might offer, and their bleed theme doesn't really shine through in solo gameplay. As a note, a recent update really nerfed the AoE potential of the yellow line spec, but they still have decent AoE in the yellow line and good survivability in that spec. For even more survivability for soloing difficult or group content, the blue line is probably your best bet, but it is going to be the slowest out of the three specs. So the Guardian has slightly better travel than the Champion and Captain with a very fast movement speed buff on a relatively short cooldown, but what does the Guardian really offer over Champion other than like a totally different gameplay kit? Well, it's going to be defenses. Guardian is going to be lower damage than the Champion, especially in AoE burst damage as I mentioned, but it has all around more survivability, so that's really what you get out of the Guardian. She must have heard Hunter and thought we were talking about the class in World of Warcraft that has pets. The Hunter in the Lord of the Rings Online does not have pets, but it is the class that I see most recommended for both beginners and solo gameplay. And that is actually for good reason, because the Hunter is our first range class and they have great range damage, surprisingly good self-healing on top of utility and crowd control for survival, and they are one of the best traveling classes in the game with ports all around major cities in Middle-earth. So the red line is going to typically output the most damage and has like great burst damage for solo gameplay, but the blue line spec offers great mobility because you can cast your abilities while moving, a great benefit for that. So for some players, this will give the blue line an edge in solo gameplay because you can kite enemies and even solo tougher content in the game while self-healing and kiting at the same time, as we see in the gameplay here. The yellow line now is going to typically be seen as the weakest of the three specs, but it can be a fun alternative that can be useful in soloing difficult content, especially when there are a large number of tough mobs. Even with the three specs and their intricacies, the Hunter is fairly beginner friendly with its gameplay kit as well. So now that we have covered gameplay, back to traveling. So compared to Wardens, who we will get to later, they do have similar travel skills as the Hunter is going to offer a couple extra very convenient ports available to them. And you can even get a skill to bind a campfire as a port. And not too relevant for solo gameplay, the Hunter ports can actually port fellowship members with them. And they also have a nice toggleable out of combat run speed buff to just top it all off so they can run fast through Middle-earth. And really, there's just not much to dislike about solo gameplay on a Hunter. But their one downside, their one weakness, that is going to be that they're just relatively squishy. They are a medium armored class, and it can be kind of tough to solo content when kiting just doesn't quite work. Some other classes, such as the Beorning that we have already covered, they will have a much easier time soloing group instances compared to the Hunter. Now, it's good news for my cat because the Lore Master, that is going to be a pet class. So it's a bit of an odd class for solo gameplay in my experience, and that's largely because of their pet and its strength as you level. And then their abilities also are going to be a mix of low damage and short cooldown and very high damage long cooldown abilities. And with the recent rework, I will say the damage feels a bit more consistent between multiple fights, but it may still feel a bit odd paced compared to other classes where sometimes you can have a large AoE just one-shot a whole camp of mobs, or it can take a long while to defeat just a single enemy. Lore Masters are also going to be quite squishy, and besides their pet, they don't really get good survivability skills until Water Lore at level 77, which is really getting up there in terms of level. Now, as far as pets go, the bear is going to be a decent tank. It's mainly used to taunt enemies, but it becomes squishy at high levels like the other Lore Master pets. The Bog Guardian offers great damage at low levels. The feline pets start off with pretty decent damage, and then the crow is mainly going to be used with debuffs, while the eagle is going to be good for a self-res if necessary. Overall, the pets will actually outshine the LM at the low levels because they just do really high damage at low levels. Until it seems like around the mid 20s to around level 30, the Lore Master will start doing enough damage to start feeling impactful at that point at least. And then at high levels, that's where pets really suffer. They just like stop scaling well at all, and they start doing very little damage and are mainly going to be used for their debuffs or specific effects such as Bear's Taunts. If you are curious about the level that the pets really stop scaling all that well, I've noticed it around level mid 50s to 60 on the Lore Master that the pets are just significantly weaker than they were even just 20-30 levels before that. And then they really stop scaling around level 100, 105 plus. That's where it's going to be even more significant how weak the pets are besides their specific effects. Just as a note. For the Lore Master specializations, the blue line does not really offer much after the low levels. That is, until you can get the new Murder of Crows trait, which gives you one of the strongest abilities in the entire game that can take out, like it can allow you to take out some very challenging mobs. And as we see in the background here, the single ability, just that one ability, can take out a full elite 3-man instance boss mob on its own here. But back on topic, with the blue line, outside of low levels, and if you don't really want the Murder of Crows ability, the red line will offer the most explosive experience and it will have a lot of damage to go with it. Overall, with some smart pet utilization and focusing on debuffs, the Lore Master can be pretty good at soloing group content, but this is also going to be greatly aided by that Water Lore ability, your self-heal ability, starting at level 77. And this is going to be one area where the group-focused yellow line spec can help, but it will be a very slow experience, especially compared to, well, blue or yellow line, really. And then like a few other classes, the Lore Master is not always going to be the strongest, but it has a really unique solo gameplay experience and is the only class in the game with animal pets. And all the while, you can roleplay as a Gandalf-like wizard. Not unlike the Guardian, the Minstrel used to only be useful for its healing capabilities, but nowadays, minis pack quite the punch with their music and shouts. Their gameplay is similar to the Blue Line Hunter, but with more AoE potential, and while they are squishier than Blue Line Hunter, they overall will offer more self-healing capability. All of their damaging abilities can be used while moving, allowing them to kite, and they have quite the fast pace in combat. Travel-wise, unfortunately, a downside of Minstrel is they just have nothing. Now, the other main downside playing a mini solo is they are light armor, as I mentioned, and relatively squishy. Their self-heals and defenses just don't quite hold up for soloing group content, especially when you cannot kite reliably. Now, as far as specs go, the red line is the DPS spec and pretty much the standard for solo Minstrel gameplay. The blue line is for healing, and the yellow line might give you a little bit of a better chance in soloing difficult content, depending on the situation, but in my experience, usually red is better with its high damage anyway. So overall, the Minstrel provides a unique gameplay experience like basically all the classes in LOTRO, and does so while having some great solo potential. Just know that traveling will not be as easy as other classes. We really are on a streak with tactical classes here. We have the Rune Keeper, which is a solid choice for solo gameplay. While like other tactical classes, the very low levels can be slow and low damage, but that's a bit deceiving because they develop into what is kind of like the light armor counterpart to the Hunter when soloing, because they have high damage and some actually pretty good self-healing, and they even have a bit of utility and crowd control to top it all off. For the Rune Keeper specs, we have the yellow line, which is going to be mobile with instant cast abilities and a decent bit of AoE and some extra crowd control. Typically, players use the yellow line lightning spec for solo, but the red line fire spec, that one's going to have good burst damage to open fights even, and it has decent AoE as well. One problem with the spec on top of actually having inductions is that a lot of the damage is going to be over time, so it can be hard to realize that in short solo fights. Now finally, the blue line is the heal spec, and it really just doesn't offer much for solo. Of course, you want to heal allies in that one. So unlike the Hunter, the biggest downside of the Rune Keeper is traveling. While they can quest and kill things just as fast as the Hunter, they have no movement speed boost and no ports. So otherwise, Rune Keepers really are great for solo, but just like the Minstrel, soloing group content can be a bit tough due to their light armor squishiness. We made it to the last class, and this is my personal favorite, the Warden. Now, how do Wardens hold up to solo gameplay? Well, they are by no means a weak solo class, but I must admit the experience on them might feel a bit odd. Even though Wardens are themed around damage over time, they actually still kill mobs plenty fast, and they have great AoE damage to back it up. At low levels, their ranged abilities aren't going to be too strong, but starting around mid levels and especially high levels, notably level 80, they have very high range damage and ranged AoE damage. An additional benefit for solo Wardens is you often only have to use one single damage over time ability, and just like a few short ticks later, the mob will die and you can start moving on in the meantime. As far as defenses go, Wardens are a medium armor class, but they do have great self-heals, especially with the latest update which buffed the self-heals, where they are once again actually great at high levels and not just great at low levels. Wardens can also spec into the blue line tank spec for extra defenses and stronger healing, making them one of the best classes for soloing group content. And as far as the other specs go, we have the red line, which will give the most melee damage, while the yellow line will give the most ranged damage. Pretty simple there. Both of them have single target and AoE. But of course, with this, a benefit of the Warden is you can swap between the melee and ranged stance freely, no matter what spec you are in. And yes, there is one thing I got to mention. They don't have quite as many ports compared to the Hunter. The Hunters get a couple extra ports because they just do. But to make up for that, they have a great out-of-combat run speed buff that is a touch faster than the Hunters. So at this point, you may be wondering, do Wardens really have any weaknesses, since it sure sounds like they can do it all? Unfortunately, yes, but that is going to be in their difficulty to play them. Wardens are not really a beginner-friendly class, unlike many of the other classes, such as the Hunter we keep comparing to, and that's going to be largely due to their gambit system. They are also not a great class if you experience a lot of lag, because lag can easily mess up your combos with the gambit system. Now that I have broken down all the classes in LOTRO and their pros and cons for solo play, we can finally evaluate which class is best, which is what everybody came to this video for. So the best solo class will require great speed and damage, great traveling capabilities to get around Middle Earth quickly and without hassle, and then of course self-sustain to avoid downtime and just dying. So two classes check all those boxes with the Hunter and Warden, and a little bit the Beorning, as we'll get to later. So between these two, the Hunter is much more beginner friendly, but it will have a tougher time soloing group content. The Warden is also going to be a bit weaker at low levels compared to Hunter until about level 16. Even after that, it takes a good while for the Warden's range damage to really shine through, and it doesn't move into the upper echelon until about level 80. However, what the Warden will offer is more AoE damage, and it also has some really great self-heals and defenses to back up large AoE pools where the Hunter may struggle. And finally, as mentioned, the Warden can much more easily solo group content, including some of the dungeons in the game. If you're a brand new player, I honestly don't recommend jumping straight in with the Warden, but after you get a feel for the game, I can always recommend that everybody at least try it to see if you like it, because they really are awesome. So yeah, there we have it. I do generally consider the Hunter and Warden to generally be the best classes for solo. But the main chunk of this video going over all the other classes still had a point. I still really do think the best class for you to play as a main character is the one that you have most fun with. What if you don't like either the Hunter or Warden? Well, you could try a magical class, maybe the Rune Keeper for its high damage and self-heals. Maybe if you love shouting and playing music, there's the Minstrel. Maybe you like melee classes, then it's really hard to go wrong with the champion, but maybe you want to be a bit tankier. Well, then you can do the Guardian. Maybe you like the idea of soloing dungeons like the Warden, but you also like the idea of playing a giant bear. Well, then the Beorning may be right for you, because they also have high damage, and the Beorning, as we covered, offers some pretty decent travel. And really the same idea is going to apply to all the other classes as we covered earlier, even the unseen ones. I honestly thought about even doing this video as a tier list, but how it would really end up is we'd have Hunter and Warden at the top, then all the other classes would be in the next tier, because they really are all great in their own way at soloing content and just playing through the game solo questing and the such, and then some of them can have a little bit of an edge in solo and group content. Usually those are going to be the tankier ones that just have general defenses to survive things, and then the ones that are pushed up a little bit more extreme are the ones that have self-heals to top that off. And yeah, if y'all can't tell, I honestly just like all the classes in LOTRO and like playing all of them solo. So perhaps if you're still stuck in choosing a solo class, this video did help some, and maybe you can try just making new characters of different classes and testing out what works for you. And with that, that is all I have for this video. Please do share what your favorite solo class and what you think the best solo class is in the game in the comments. And if you enjoyed this video or learned something useful, please consider liking and subscribing for more, or becoming a channel member to support the content. And I think one of the cats has been roaming around here. And thanks for watching, everyone.